I wasn't invited to my own son's wedding, so I bought the venue myself, and with one signature, I made sure no one else walked down that aisle. What happened next will shock you. But before we continue, hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. My name is Lorraine Myers, and I'm 68 years old, a mother, a widow, and apparently the last person to know my only child is getting married. I was sitting in my favourite chair by the window, the one with the worn armrests and the cushion that leans slightly to the left, scrolling through Facebook with a cup of lukewarm tea in hand when the photo appeared. There he was, my son Eric, standing in a sunlit vineyard, smiling with his fiancée as they held a wooden sign that said June 22nd, Tuscany Gardens. The caption read, "Can't wait to marry my best friend," and in that instant, the air left my lungs. I blinked once, twice, hoping I had misread it, that maybe this was some styled photo shoot or part of a friend's engagement. But the comments were very real. So beautiful, can't wait. Tuscany Gardens is stunning, you two are perfect. Only a few months away. Each like and heart reacted like a stamp sealing a secret envelope I had never received. My fingers trembled as I refreshed my inbox. No message, no email. I checked the pile of mail on the counter behind me, just in case I missed something among the bills and flyers. Nothing. Not even a text. The last time I spoke to Eric was in January, when I asked gently if they had picked a date yet. He laughed and said they were still deciding. I remember smiling at the sound of his voice, thinking how grown he sounded. I never imagined it was already decided. My name was nowhere on the post. I wasn't tagged. There was no mention of a mother, no shout out to family support, no caption about being grateful. Just wine glasses, white dresses, and golden hour lighting, as if they lived in a world that never had room for me. I sat there in that chair as the house around me went still, except for the gentle tick of the kitchen clock. The quiet began to hum, not with confusion but clarity. This wasn't an accident. This was planned. And as I stared into the screen at a celebration I was never meant to see, I realized something else. They thought I would take it silently, that I would swallow the hurt and let it sit in my chest like every other slight that had gone unspoken. But 68 gives you a certain perspective. And what I saw in that moment was not just a son's betrayal, but an opportunity, not to ruin, but to remind. Some things are not passed down. Some things must be taken back. I didn't always go by Lorraine Myers, mother of the forgotten. I used to be just Mom, the one who packed his lunch with handwritten notes, the woman who clapped the loudest at every school play, even when he only had one line, the arms he ran to when he skinned his knees, or when the world felt too sharp. When his father walked out, I was 39, freshly abandoned, working nights as a cashier and mornings cleaning houses just to keep the lights on. I pawned my wedding ring for rent that Christmas and told Eric Santa had simply run out of our zip code. When he got accepted to college, I cried so hard in the grocery store parking lot that a woman handed me a coupon for tissues. I sold the gold earrings my mother gave me to help cover the tuition deposit. I never told him. I wanted him to feel proud, not guilty. And when he called me years later, voice shaking with nervous joy, and said he had found the one, I smiled through the phone even though I had never met her. He asked me quietly if I could help with the down payment on the ring, and I wired the money that same afternoon. Not because I had it to spare, but because I knew what love costs. I never expected parades or plaques. I just thought I had earned a seat at the table, maybe not at the center, but close enough to toast their future. Instead, I'm watching it unfold from behind a screen, like some distant relative who never mattered in the first place. That ring I helped pay for now sparkles in a photo I wasn't meant to see, nestled on a hand that never shook mine with real warmth. I am not angry so much as I am hollowed. You don't need to be stabbed to bleed. Sometimes it's silence that cuts the deepest. And as I sat there surrounded by photo albums filled with our life, I realized I had shifted roles without notice. From comfort to inconvenience, from mother to outsider. People talk about growing apart, but they never mention how it feels when the distance is built by the very hands you once held. I used to believe love was a constant, a thread that never snapped. But what do you do when your thread is quietly snipped and buried beneath someone else's perfect narrative? You gather what's left. You remember who you are. And if they won't give you a seat at the table, you flip the whole table over. Quietly, gracefully, and in your own time. I told myself it had to be a mistake, that surely there had been an oversight, a delay, maybe even a lost invitation somewhere between the mailbox and my porch. I rehearsed every version of the conversation I was about to have as I stared at the phone in my hand, willing it to feel lighter. When I finally dialed Eric's number, my fingers trembled but my voice was steady, the kind of steady that only comes from years of learning how to swallow hurt. He picked up on the third ring, casual and rushed, like he had better places to be. I asked him about the wedding, soft at first, trying not to sound accusatory, just a mother, asking a simple question. There was a pause, the kind that makes your stomach sink before your heart catches up, and then he said, "It's just going to be small. Mostly her family. We didn't think you'd be comfortable." That word, we, landed like a slap made of silk. I didn't respond right away. I just listened to the spaces between his words, the ones filled with assumptions he had made about me, about what I could handle, about what I was worth. I could have reminded him of the years I stood in cold bleachers, the nights I stayed up sewing Halloween costumes from scratch, the way I carried us both through storms he barely remembers. But instead I simply said, "I see," and hung up before my voice could betray me. I stared at the silence in my living room, the walls that had once echoed with his laughter, now holding only the stillness of a mother who had just been benched from the most important day of her son's life. I did not scream. I did not cry, not yet. I just sat there, feeling the shape of my grief settle into something cold and quiet. The kind of grief that does not beg to be comforted, because it knows comfort will not come. I had spent decades making myself smaller so others could shine. I had folded myself into every version of mother they needed. And now, in the year he promised someone else forever, I became inconvenient, uninvited, unnecessary. But even in that moment, I knew something had shifted. Not just between us, but within me. They had written me out of the script, so I picked up a pen. And this time, I would be the one writing the ending. I had not touched the bottom drawer of my old filing cabinet in years, the one where I kept the remnants of my former life, tucked beneath tax records and faded warranties. But that afternoon, with my heart still bruised and my hands trembling with something I could not quite name, I opened it. The metal creaked like an old friend being asked to carry one more secret. Inside, I found what I was looking for, a battered maroon folder labeled Venues and Vendors in my own handwriting, careful cursive I had once used to keep weddings from falling apart. Before I was just someone's mother, I had been Lorraine Shaw, the planner you called when things needed to be perfect. I had folded napkins into roses, turned parking lots into ballrooms, soothed brides, calmed mothers-in-law, and somehow made dreams happen with duct tape and deadlines. I sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through signed contracts, notes scribbled in margins, seating charts, floral mock-ups, all the ghosts of events I had brought to life. And then I found it. Tuscany Gardens. My breath caught That was the name from the post, the venue they had chosen. I scanned the paperwork, my fingers tightening, when I saw the signature at the bottom. Vincent M. Rallo. I remembered him. Kind eyes. A soft spot for lemon pound cake. A handshake. Like a warm blanket. I had helped launch his daughter's quinceañera back in the day, and he had told me then, "You ever need anything, Lorraine? You call me direct." That was before arthritis took over my hands, and before I traded centerpieces for crossword puzzles. But I remembered. And I remembered something else too. Rumors about the property being up for sale, whispers floating around the church bulletin and bingo tables. I closed the folder and set it on the table like it might combust. This was not vengeance stirring in me, not spite or some petty thirst for attention. It was something deeper, a sense of balance needing to be restored. They had made me a stranger in a story I helped begin. I had given my life to others, and they had handed me silence in return. Now, life was handing me a pen, and I had never been afraid of paperwork. I stood up slowly, knees aching in protest, and reached for my phone. I had a number to call, and this time, I would not be left out. The meeting took place on a Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky looks half awake and the coffee tastes like purpose. I wore navy, the colour I used to save for negotiations and eulogies, and drove to Tuscany Gardens with a manila envelope in my lap and a heart steady enough to handle what I was about to do. Vincent greeted me with that same smile, a little greyer now, but still warm like the first sip of soup on a sick day. We didn't need to say much. He remembered who I was. He remembered the cake I ordered for his daughter, and how I held her hand when she cried about the wrong shade of lavender. I told him I was interested in the property, and he raised an eyebrow like he was surprised but not suspicious. I said I wanted it clean, no leftover contracts, no upcoming obligations. Just the keys and the deed. He thumbed through the paperwork I slid across the table, his eyes pausing on the LLC I had quietly reactivated last week, Shore Event Properties. It felt like opening a window in a room that had been sealed too long. We talked logistics. He offered a fair price, and I did not haggle. I paid in full. Every dollar came from the savings I had built over decades of being careful, invisible, dependable. Money meant for retirement cruises and orthopedic mattresses now poured into the foundation of something far more personal. Before we signed, I pulled out one more page, a short clause I had drafted myself, clear and simple. No weddings may be hosted on the premises without the express written consent of the owner. Vincent chuckled when he read it, then looked at me with the kind of respect men only show when they realize they underestimated you. "Trouble at home?" he asked, and I just smiled. "Not anymore." The pen moved across the contract with satisfying weight, each signature sealing a version of justice no one would see coming. He handed me the keys and I held them in my palm like tiny pieces of armor. As I stepped back out into the sunlight, the gravel crunched beneath my shoes. The sound of old ground shifting to make space for something new. I looked up at the arches, the stained glass, the trimmed hedges that would no longer host their celebration, and for the first time in weeks, I did not feel like an afterthought. I felt like the architect of my own peace. The day the invitations started arriving, I was outside trimming the hydrangeas when Mrs. Colby from 2 doors down waved a cream-coloured envelope like she had won a prize on a game show. "Tuscany Gardens, can you believe it?" she chirped, already speculating about menu choices and seating arrangements. I smiled and nodded, complimented her new haircut, and returned to my shears, clipping a little slower than usual. That evening, I walked to the mailbox with the same quiet hope I used to carry when my son would come home late from football practice, praying he would remember to call or at least walk in with an apology in his eyes. But the box was empty except for a grocery flyer and a coupon for gutter cleaning. No gold foil, no embossed lettering, nothing. I checked again the next morning and the morning after that, pretending I had simply missed it, that it had slipped behind something or been delayed by some innocent postal hiccup. But as the week passed and neighbours continued to casually mention their plans to attend the June wedding, the truth landed like snow on a branch already bowed too low. The mailman's daughter, a girl who once backed into our fence and never apologised, received one. Even the Thompsons, who had just returned from a 6-month cruise and barely knew the couple, had one pinned to their fridge like a holiday card. Me? I was not even an afterthought. I was air. And yet I did not cry. I did not stew or spiral. I set the hydrangeas in a vase, lit a lavender candle, and sat down at my desk. I opened my planner and drew a slow circle around the 22nd of June, not with a pen but with intention. A quiet circle of knowing. My name was not on that guest list, but I was very much part of that day, more than they could possibly imagine. I brewed tea, humming as I added honey, and watched the steam rise like a silent curtain lifting on the next act of a play I had just begun writing. Some invitations arrive on cardstock, tied with ribbon and scented with artificial rose. Others arrive as silence, as omissions, as the clear declaration that you are no longer welcome in a story you helped build. But I have learned that silence is not empty. Sometimes it is full of answers. And this one, this absence, told me everything I needed to know. I was not being overlooked. I was being erased. And I have never been the kind of woman who disappears quietly. The call came in on a Tuesday morning, and I knew it would. I had spent the past week tending my garden with the same calm I once used to frost wedding cakes. Delicate and deliberate, knowing the storm would arrive soon enough. The bride's mother called Tuscany Gardens just as I predicted, her voice no doubt filled with that brittle blend of entitlement and forced charm that women like her wore like pearls, polished and performative. The new manager, a kind young man named Devon whom I had personally interviewed and hired, answered with the professional ease I had trained him to perfect. "I'm so sorry," he said, his tone sweet as spring lemonade. "But that wedding date has been removed from the calendar. The new owner has other plans for the venue." There was a pause, long enough for me to imagine the colour draining from her cheeks as the realization bloomed. "I beg your pardon," she probably said, each syllable clipped and tight. "That date has been booked for months." Devon, steady and unshaken, gently repeated himself, letting the words hang in the air like a broken ornament. "The new owner has other plans. And those plans? Well, they were mine." I sat in my reading chair, sipping chamomile tea, my phone face down on the table beside me. But I could almost hear her escalating, demanding to know who the new owner was, what kind of mix-up this could possibly be, and when someone planned to make it right. But there was no mistake. The contract had been voided legally, quietly, and without drama. It had a clause that allowed cancellation under new ownership, and I had slipped that clause in with the same steady hand I used to slip birthday money into my son's coat pocket when he was too proud to ask for help. That date was mine now. That garden was mine. The vines, the lanterns, the stone path where they planned to take photos and pretend their family was whole, it was all mine. And I had no plans to fill it with champagne toasts and shallow declarations. I would leave it empty, a silent space that echoed louder than any speech they could give. The bride's mother would hang up eventually, flustered and furious, and she would call my son, and he would call me. But I would not answer, because now I was the one with other plans. Plans that did not involve playing nice while being forgotten. Plans that finally included myself. The phone rang in the middle of a quiet afternoon, just as I was steeping a fresh pot of Earl Grey and folding linen napkins, not for any event, but simply because I liked the way they looked, neatly arranged. When I saw her name flash on the screen, I didn't hesitate to answer. I wanted to hear the panic in her voice. "How could you do this to us?" She snapped before I could say hello, her words high-pitched and trembling like a violin string pulled too tight. "Do what exactly?" I asked. Not out of ignorance, but because I wanted her to say it out loud, to put voice to what she had orchestrated behind my back. "You bought the venue," she hissed. "You knew we were getting married there. You did this to ruin everything." I could almost see her in that moment, probably pacing around her kitchen in some designer loungewear, manicured nails clenching the phone while her perfect engagement ring caught the light. I pictured the chaos behind her, florists needing answers, caterers on hold, seating charts in shambles, and I sipped my tea slowly before answering. "I wouldn't know," I said, my tone even and unbothered. "I wasn't invited." There was a pause, the kind of silence that crashes like a wave because it says more than any insult ever could. Then, before she could respond, I hung up. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. That was the last conversation I ever needed to have with her. I sat back and let the warmth of the cup settle into my palms while outside, the wind rustled the daffodils in my garden, the same flowers I had once planted with my son, when he was still small enough to hold my hand without embarrassment. I wondered if he was nearby, watching the fallout, choosing silence like he so often did. Or if he was still defending her, as if betrayal needed an alibi. Either way, the chaos was no longer mine to clean up. Let them scramble, let them panic, let the wedding become a lesson in arrogance. I had done nothing but claim the space they tried to erase me from. And now, whether they acknowledged it or not, every decision moved through me. I was not a ghost to be ignored. I was a storm they never saw coming. And that storm had just swept the lace right out from under them. It started with the florist. A polite email stating that without a confirmed venue address, she could not proceed with delivery. Then came the photographer, who mentioned a double booking he had accidentally overlooked and offered to return their deposit. The caterer followed next, citing logistics and timing, though I knew it was really about reputation. Tuscany Gardens was the kind of place that carried weight in the local wedding scene, and now, under my name, its loyalty followed me. One by one, the dominoes tipped until their perfect wedding started to resemble a crumbling card house, each pillar collapsing under the weight of poor planning and bruised pride. I imagined her pacing, flipping through a planner thick with pastel tabs and calligraphy, every page a reminder of something now ruined. I didn't gloat, not openly, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the same silence I had been met with was now echoing back toward them, amplified through unanswered emails and disconnected phone calls. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. It was my son. I let it ring twice before picking up, steadying my voice. "Hi," he said, and it caught me how small his voice sounded, like the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Hi," I replied, letting the words sit between us. "Things are a little complicated," he said, a pause stretching on. "The venue cancelled. The vendors too. I don't know what to do." I waited a moment before answering. "Maybe you should have thought of that before erasing your mother from your life." He didn't argue, just exhaled, like the wind had been knocked out of him. "I didn't want to hurt you," he finally said. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how absurd the lie sounded when spoken aloud. "You didn't want to include me either," I replied. The silence returned, thick as honey, and when he asked if there was anything I could do, I said only, I think it's too late for that now. Then I ended the call. Not because I was angry, but because some bridges are not meant to be crossed again. They're meant to burn and illuminate the truth that was there all along. And this truth was simple. A wedding without a mother's heart is just a party without a soul. Let them figure that out on their own. He came to my house the next evening, hair disheveled, shirt wrinkled, looking like the world had finally caught up to him, and in a way, I suppose it had. I watched him through the curtain before I opened the door, remembering the countless times I had sat on the porch waiting for him to come home after curfew, praying he was safe, always forgiving when he wasn't. Now here he was, a grown man with trembling hands and eyes darting around like a boy with a confession. I let him in. No hugs, no tea, just space and silence. He stood in my living room surrounded by the photos he had forgotten, the quilt I had made him when he got his first apartment, the framed drawing he gave me in 3rd grade that still hung beside the hallway. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said, and I could tell he had rehearsed it, as if a well-timed apology might smooth over months of exclusion. It got out of hand. She said you wouldn't be comfortable. Her family. They're different. There was pressure. I didn't want drama. I sat down and let the words swirl around me like smoke from a candle just snuffed out. His voice cracked on the word pressure, as if the weight of other people's opinions could outweigh years of birthday parties, scraped knees, and late-night calls that only I ever answered. You made your choice, I said quietly, each word deliberate, like stepping stones across a frozen river. You made your choice when you left me out, when you sent invitations to the mailman's daughter but not your own mother, when you let silence speak louder than love. He opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. I'm not angry. I'm done being angry. What I feel now is clarity. He looked around again, eyes landing on the piano he once begged me to buy, the one I paid for by pawning my engagement ring. I didn't mean to hurt you, he whispered, but the words floated to the floor like dropped petals, pretty but meaningless. Intent doesn't erase impact, I replied. I walked him to the door. Slowly, my hand on his back for one brief moment that still held a mother's warmth. I hope the wedding finds a new home, I said softly. And I hope someday you find your way back to what matters. Then I closed the door behind him. This time, I didn't cry. The bouquet arrived just before noon, wrapped in expensive paper with gold trim and tied with a ribbon too pristine to have ever touched sincerity. I knew who sent it before I even looked at the card. The florist smiled kindly as she handed it over, no doubt assuming she was delivering a gesture of reconciliation, unaware she was merely the messenger of too little, too late. The flowers were peonies, my favourite, the kind he used to pick from the neighbour's yard when he was 7 and swear they were wildflowers. Back then, the thought mattered. Now it just felt like strategy. I placed the bouquet on the kitchen counter, stared at it for a moment, then walked out to the garbage bin and dropped it in without ceremony. I wasn't angry. I was done being angry. I was also done accepting scraps of affection dressed in roses and wrapped in guilt. An hour later, a courier delivered a handwritten letter, the envelope thick with whatever he imagined would make things right. I didn't even open it. I walked straight to the shredder in the study and fed it through, the blades slicing through words I didn't need to read to understand. Apologies that come after humiliation are not olive branches. They're erasers, desperate attempts to rewrite what already carved itself into memory. By evening, my phone buzzed with a voicemail. I recognized his voice as it spilled through the speaker, low and shaking, saying things like, "I made a mistake and I miss you, and can we talk?" I listened until the end, let the silence ring out after the beep, then deleted it. I didn't need more words. I needed time, respect, the kind that isn't begged for once everything else has fallen apart. In the quiet that followed, I sat by the window with a cup of chamomile, watching the wind bend the branches of the sycamore tree in the yard. The same tree he used to climb. The same one I had stood under each year to take his first day of school photos. I thought of all the things I had forgiven before. The missed birthdays, the holidays shortened for convenience, the growing distance disguised as adulthood. This time was different. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was removal, intentional, and complete. And no bouquet, no letter, no voicemail could undo the echo of that choice. Some things don't bloom again just because you water them after the frost. The 22nd of June arrived without fanfare, without the crescendo of organ music or the fluttering chaos of bridesmaids rushing in heels. Tuscany Gardens, once reserved and meticulously planned for a day I was never meant to witness, stood in perfect, untouched stillness. The air smelled of early summer roses and lavender, the garden paths freshly raked, as if waiting for a procession that would never come. I wore a soft linen dress, the colour of old pearls, and brought with me a porcelain teacup trimmed in gold that I used to offer brides on their rehearsal mornings, a relic from the days when I orchestrated joy for strangers who trusted me with their happiest moments. Today, it was just me and the flowers, and that was more than enough. I walked slowly along the cobblestone paths I once helped design, pausing at the gazebo where they were supposed to say their vows, where love was meant to bloom publicly but never took root privately. The vines had grown thicker since the last time I stood there, curling around the white wood like quiet witnesses to everything left unsaid. I sat on the wrought iron bench near the fountain, poured my tea, and watched the koi move lazily beneath the lily pads, their world undisturbed by invitations or excuses. No guests arrived. No photos were taken. No promises exchanged. Somewhere, I imagined the bride pacing, the groom sulking, phones ringing with vendors asking what went wrong. But here, in this place, nothing felt wrong. It felt reclaimed. I was never meant to walk these grounds today, but I did, on my own terms, without permission, without apology. The only soundtrack was birdsong and the distant chime of wind through the arched windows. I had spent decades giving, building, making moments for others that often excluded me in the long run. But today, this moment was mine. I sipped my tea, let the warmth settle in my chest, and breathed in a silence that felt more sacred than any aisle ever could. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was simply present, in the very space I was told I didn't belong. And maybe that was the true ceremony. Not dresses and menus and guest lists, but the quiet reclaiming of worth, of space, of self. The garden didn't know what it was missing, but I did. And that truth, steeped in lavender and peace, was worth every petal. Instead of letting the 22nd of June waste away as a day steeped in what could have beens, I decided to make it something better. I sent handwritten invitations on thick cardstock to the people who had actually shown up in my life, not just when it was convenient or photogenic, but in those quiet, unseen moments that never made it to social media. My neighbour Gloria brought her folding chairs and her peach cobbler, the one with the crumble that melts on your tongue. The retired librarian who used to help me pick books for my son when he was 5 came with lemon bars wrapped in wax paper and stories about the time he spilled juice on a first edition. I invited the women from the local shelter too, the ones who understood that loss wears many faces and that sometimes rebuilding starts with something as simple as being invited. The courtyard at Tuscany Gardens, my courtyard now, bloomed with more than flowers. Children chased bubbles, their laughter rising above the lilac hedges like wind chimes, and the scent of barbecue drifted from the corner where the community centre's volunteer chef flipped burgers in his apron. I wore my mother's sun hat, the wide-brimmed one she passed to me, the day I signed my first wedding contract, and greeted each guest like they were royalty, because in this story, they were. There were no speeches, no first dances, no towering cakes, just small plates, mason jars of sweet tea, a playlist full of soul and Motown, and the sound of chairs dragging across gravel as people leaned in closer to talk. Someone brought a Polaroid camera, and we filled a whole table with snapshots of smiling faces, held together by clothespins and a bit of twine, every image more real than the glossy, save the date card that never came to my mailbox. At one point, an elderly woman from the shelter took my hand and said, with eyes watering just enough to catch the sun, that this was the first time in years she had felt part of something beautiful. That's when it hit me. I had not just taken back a date, or a venue, or a narrative. I had built a celebration out of everything I had been denied. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was joy, served warm with cornbread and laughter, under a sky that did not ask who was missing, only who had come. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the sky is indecisive and the wind feels like it is still making up its mind about spring, when I heard the knock. 3 soft taps, uncertain, followed by a pause long enough to wonder if I had imagined it. I rose from my chair by the window, the one that overlooks the lilac bushes, and walked slowly to the door, tea in hand. Through the peephole, I saw him, my son, the boy I once rocked through fevers and growing pains, now standing on my porch, with eyes swollen and shirt untucked like a child who had finally realized the rules of the game he thought he was winning. I cracked the door just enough to let the breeze pass through and met his gaze. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not in stature, but in the way grief does to a man who built his house on sand. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked, already breaking before the apology came. "I'm sorry," he whispered, eyes blinking against tears that didn't fall fast enough to wash away what had already settled between us. I said nothing at first. I just watched him. Let the silence stretch like a clothesline between us, sagging under the weight of everything he hadn't said before. "I was wrong," he continued. "I let her talk me into it. I thought you wouldn't want to come. I didn't know how much it would hurt you." I took a sip of my tea, the way my mother used to when she was buying time to decide how much of herself to give. "You didn't think," I said finally, not cruelly, just clearly. And that's what hurt. He looked down then, like the concrete had answers. I didn't slam the door. I didn't invite him in either. I simply held my ground. One hand on the knob, the other still holding the warmth of the cup, and let him feel the space he had carved with absence. I told him I appreciated the apology, and I meant it, but forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not a switch you flip with tears and a trembling voice. It is a process, a choice made over time. He asked if we could talk more soon, and I said maybe. Not as punishment, but as truth. Some wounds need air before they close, and I was just beginning to breathe. The roses at Tuscany Gardens bloom brighter now, not because of better soil or longer sunlight, but because the laughter has changed. I kept the venue, not as a trophy but as a tool, not as a monument to what I lost but as a canvas for what I could still give. Since that June day, we've held retirement parties beneath the arched trellis, golden anniversaries by the koi pond, community fundraisers in the great hall lit with lanterns I hand-selected myself. I walk the paths with a clipboard in one hand and a cup of tea in the other, my name now etched on the brass plaque beside the gates, not as a donor or a relative but as the owner. The air smells sweeter when you know the space you stand in is truly yours, not borrowed or begged for, but claimed with intention and resolve. Children laugh as they chase each other across the lawn. Women from the local shelter I support dance barefoot in the grass during our monthly garden parties, and old friends raise glasses under the pergola draped with ivy that I insisted on preserving. No one asks about the wedding that never was, not directly. But occasionally, a curious soul will sidle up during cleanup or just after dusk when the fairy lights are flickering and ask, half teasing, "Is it true what they say about why you bought the place?" I just smile, the kind of smile that has history in it, and say, "Some people forget who built the stage they dance on." I do not name names. I do not air grievances. I simply water the roses and pay the invoices and make sure every soul who steps through these gates feels seen, celebrated, and safe. There are photos of the venue now in local magazines, glowing reviews online, and bookings that stretch into the next calendar year. But the real victory isn't in the profit or the praise. It is in the silence that follows peace, in the dignity reclaimed not by vengeance but by vision. My voice, once dismissed or drowned out by louder ones, now carries through the courtyard with quiet authority. I speak less, but I am heard more. I love more carefully now, more deliberately, and I never again wait for someone else to offer me a seat at their table. I built my own, under the open sky, and set it with porcelain and pride.